Okay, so first of all, thank you very much to the organizer for having me on the program and to accommodate, the travel shock due to the strike at the airport. And thanks to Martin also to accept the swap. So I'm sorry you thinking of having Martin, but Martin will be anyway there after lunch. So this is a joint paper with Paolo Bonomolo and Kazi Acque. And the title is "The Long-Run Phillips Curve is a Curve." Okay, so this is an old debate. I don't think I have to, with this audience, to spend a lot of time about this. After the Phelps-Friedman Nobel Prize contribution, we all adhere to the natural rate hypothesis. And the idea is that in our models, there's no permanent trade-off, and the long-run Phillips curve is vertical. This is really one of the main tenets of macroeconomics, right? So it's something we teach to first-year macro in the ISID model. The IS long-run curve is vertical, so it's a kind of cornerstone in macroeconomic theory, but not only in theory, also in practice, right? Because also this is the working assumption of central banks in the implementation of monetary policy. Inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. That's famous Friedman quotes, and is the underpinning theoretical assumption of the inflation targeting framework, right? So you might be surprised, or at least we were very much surprised, that actually this, let's call it assumption, has not been subject to empirical work, at least not recently. Probably there's tons of work in the 70s, early 70s, after the Friedman-Phelps contribution. But here, at least the papers we find in the literature, in the recent literature, and if you compare these to the Among Us literature on the short-run Phillips curve, the slope, disappeared, does not disappeared, I mean, that's as much as zero, basically, compared to that number. And given the importance, as I just said, of this assumption, I think that, so we thought that maybe it was worth just looking at the empirical evidence again about this long-run trade-off, or the absence of this long-run trade-off, rather. And you might be surprising also to note that also many of our models would not imply superneutrality. Okay, here, let me distinguish between neutrality of money in the long run and superneutrality of money in the long run. These are two very different concepts. So the neutrality of money is about a step-level change in the quantity of the money supply. Think about the steady state of your model. If you just change the level of the money supply, then in any sensible model of monetary economics, that's a quote by Tom Sargent, then nothing happens. So nothing happens, it means that there are no real effects, and then the price level simply adjusts one-to-one with the level step. The superneutrality is a different concept. It's about the change in the rate of growth of the money supply that in all the models that I know is equal in steady state to the rate of inflation. And in many models, actually, when there is in steady state a change of this, of the rate of growth of money or the rate of inflation, there might be real effects. So without revealing my age, I'm old enough, that I taught the Sidrowski model. So that's a 1960, I think, model. That's Ramsey growth model with money in the utility function. In that model, superneutrality does not hold. The Cooley-Hansen famous paper, real business cycle model with money with cash in advance constraint. In that model, superneutrality does not hold, and that's simply because consumption is a credit goods, by leisure is not a credit good. Also only if the utility function is separable between consumption and money, otherwise it doesn't. Yeah, in order for superneutrality to hold in steady state. they don't never had a general utility function. That's, But in a cash in advance model, the intuition is very simple, right? So to buy leisure, you don't need cash, and therefore you don't pay the inflation tax. So the the main model that we use, I think, in monetary economics nowadays, which is the Keynesian model, you don't have to go that far, is also a model that would not imply superneutrality in steady state. This is just something I've been working on in the last 20 years or so, and I have a bunch of papers showing that there's no, in this model, unless you assume full long-running indexation in prices and wages, there is generally a long-run effect of a change in the steady state level of inflation. Okay. So this is an empirical paper, okay? So this is mainly an empirical paper with a main research question, if there is or there is not a longer relationship between inflation and output and what it is. So it's basically a time series model. Contrary to the previous empirical paper, I hope I will get to the results, but yeah, I think that's what we do. We do a BVAR analysis featuring time-varying trends, stochastic volatility, and nonlinearity to try to capture this trade-off if the data, or try to allow the data to capture the trade-off if the trade-off is there, rather. And we do that in a very simple way, or rather simple way, and the reason is because otherwise we won't be able to estimate this thing, and non-linearity will take the form of a piecewise linear model. We try to convince you that there is also actually quite nice methodological contribution from the econometric point of view, and therefore this is a convenient non-linear approach to the piecewise linear approach is a convenient non-linear approach. Okay. And the next question is that, okay, given whatever we will find in the data, so in the data, what you find is just an empirical correlation, right? So you find a correlation, and in order to understand or put on this correlation a causation, you need a theoretical model. And therefore, we will try to search among the structural models if we find a model that replicates the data in some ways. Okay, so that's what we do, and these are the results. So is there a long-run relationship between inflation and output in the data? The answer is yes. So the long-run Phillips curve is not vertical, it is a curve. And is negatively sloped, so higher inflation is related to lower output in the long run, so it's affecting potential output. The key to get these results is exactly estimate a nonlinear model that allows for nonlinearity in the effects of the trends, or the estimated trends. Just to give you some numbers, when trend inflation is below 4%, so when trend inflation is low, the long-run Phillips curve is vertical, as in the textbooks. But when trend inflation is higher than roughly 4%, then the long-run Phillips curve is actually negatively sloped, and quite substantially so. So the number is actually even too big to be believed in a sense, but that's what we find. So we find that every percentage point increase in the long-run inflation is related to about 1% decrease in potential output per year, which is a massive number. Structural model. So then, given these results in the empirical analysis, we didn't have to go very far to look for a structural model that replicates this. And that's, the generalized Keynesian model that I had in my computer. And that's because this model is a model that has exactly the same implication. So higher trend inflation causes lower GDP in the long run. And also has the same kind of similar non-linearity, because it has the two key features that we derive from the statistical analysis. It's non-linear and negatively sloped. And quite flat at the beginning. It's a full non-linear model, so it's not piecewise linear as our empirical analysis, but it's very flat at the beginning, so it looks like piecewise linear. It's a good approximation. And indeed, we estimate this model. So we're going to estimate, also here, we have a small methodological contribution in the sense that we're going to estimate a small Keynesian model with time-varying steady state because we'll have a time-varying trend deflation. And also there you have to use nonlinear methods because the model becomes nonlinear. And we're going to show that the model captures, in a statistical significant sense, the quantitative feature of the time series analysis, simply saying, the estimated long-run Phillips curve is statistically not different from the one that we get from the empirical analysis in the data. Anton?
Yes. That's very interesting. My question is, but
well, we can stop here.
whether you make an intention, an attempt to differentiate better between your model, the generalized Mackenzie model, where the cost is, as we know, the price dispersion that comes from the Calvo theory, and let's say the cash in advance constraint, where you would also obtain a negative effect of inflation on output, and in models of endogenous growth also on growth and so on. So is there anything that in particular in your empirical analysis ties the mechanism to the one in the G and K model, the price dispersion, or not? Or can you discriminate between these two models, the CIA, the cash in advance, and the G and K?
Yeah, very good question, perfectly taken. So
there's another question, just quickly.
It's a question related to that. I'm Argentinian, so there is high inflation and low potential output in general, but they are both symptom of another problem. It's like you have a bad government, and then you find empirical. You're gonna find that in many countries, and I don't know. It's like a common underlying factor, right, affecting both things at the same time. And you try to force it in a model that doesn't include that. I don't know how to take it. You see my point. So how do you interpret that finding? In Argentina, it's clear, right? So we have bad governments, and they do both bad. Yeah.
No, these are well taken questions. Regarding the first question by Anton, as I said, we are using this model. The paper is already long. We are actually thinking about doing exactly that. Looking at different models with the same implications. There are not that many with that particular implications, in particular in terms of the shape. But this is something on the to-do agenda. On Facundo's question, these are US data. As we try to convince you, the empirical model is relatively flexible to, it's reduced form, right? So, but there's stochastic volatility there, so it might be able to capture big shocks or whatever, right? So, but you can, if you have a particular, going back to Anton's question, if you have a particular model that you want us to test it, we can do it. You just send me the model, and we will try to do it in the next paper. And I'm serious about that. It has to be small, though, because as you can see, the econometric is really involved. So that's another point that we cannot put too many stuff in the model, and that's a limitation that it's computationally. So this is going to be a generalization of a steady state VR. So that's the empirical. Let's talk about the empirical approach. As I said, this is mainly an empirical paper. So is a time-varying equilibrium VAR that the original contribution is by Mattias Villani, which the trend was not time-varying there, and then has been used recently, famously, I think, in the Del Negro et al. Paper about the convenience yield paper, but in many other papers, and Elmar Mertens in particular from the Bundesbank has been using this model quite extensively. So the model is made up, is really a multivariate trend by cycle decomposition. That's the way you should think about it, and also that's the way I understand it. For the details, you should ask my co-authors, but let's try to see what I can give it to you. So that's you have a variable xt, is the composing trend and cycle. This is the cyclical modeling. It's just a VAR, so it's just the cyclical part is just modeled as a standard VAR, and while x bar t is a trend. And the trend is defined in this way here. So the trend depends on a set of latent processes, okay? And this set of latent processes evolve in a certain way, and there are certain shocks, okay? So the key of the paper is here, because obviously we are interested in long-run relationship between these axes, in particular between output and inflation. So let's look at the model for the long run, right? So how do we model the long run here? The VAR is small, GDP, inflation, interest rate, a typical monetary policy small VAR is a VAR with 4 legs. So this is the model. So Y bar T is is the output trend. Let's put it like this. This is going to be equal to Y star, okay, plus a function that could depend on trend inflation, right? And the data will tell us if this is a good assumption or not. Right? The rest is standard, so in this kind of model. So this is Y star, it evolves like a random walk with a drift, which is a random walk itself. And then we're going to center this delta by assumption equal to 0 when inflation is 0. So you can think of it that our Y star, it will be the empirical equivalent of the natural rate, right? The flexible price equilibrium. So then the model, if this thing exists, will give you a gap between the actual empirical trend and what would be the trend under 0 inflation or flexible prices. Yes?
So here, why is the trend growth? Growth rate, right?
Yeah, that's
the growth rate is a random walk. The innovation
it's an I2
also that it's I2 or
it's I2. That's standard. This
growth
model
is
we
I2,
also have robustness with I1 and nothing changes.
the level of output would be I3.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, the level will be I2, right? Your rate of growth is I1 and the level is I2.
So why is the growth rate?
No.
So
Why is the level?
Why is the level of output?
The level of output.
Okay.
Is the level of output. Yeah. So this is, Anton?
Would it be a model of endogenous growth, let's say, that can map to this?
Yes, we don't have growth in the model, so we're going to abstract from. So Anton is asking if we have in our model something like this. The answer is not. So we abstract from growth in the model. Okay. So you can think in the model we have these variables in deviation from the trend. So inflation is just a model as, again, standard in this model is a random walk. And then the nominal interest rate, this is just taking the drift, is taken in from Laubach and Williams. So it's going to depend on inflation, on trend, on the growth trend, and on the Z component. The Z component is its model as a random walk, and it's going to capture everything that moves the real rate, right? Demographics or whatever other variables you can think that moves the natural real rate. Importantly, we're going to have stochastic volatility in these shocks. Okay, so the key thing is the following one. So how do you model this delta function? Okay, which is the key, I think, of the paper. We're gonna model for a reason that I'll try to convince you is the good reasons as a piecewise linear function. Okay, so delta will have 2 parameters and 2 possible slopes. Let's say K1 and K2, and these are different depending if the trend inflation level is above or below a certain threshold, and we're gonna estimate jointly kappa 1, kappa 2, and tau, which is the threshold. CK is there just to make this function continuous, such that in the kink they mesh. Okay. So why this is a good assumption, we think. First of all, because it's sufficiently flexible to allow very different kind of nonlinearity. Like it can be like this, can be like this, can be like this. Second, it's easy to interpret and to explain to people I now talk to quite often, policymakers. So if inflation is above a threshold, then this happens. If below that, the other thing happens. And most importantly, actually, it allows to estimate this thing very efficiently, as we'll explain in a second. So this is the empirical model. There is written in state space form. So that's the observation equation. This is the state equation with this latent variable. And actually, the model is actually like this because we don't have a fully nonlinear function for delta. And therefore, we just have basically two possible states there. So the methodological contribution is that under this assumption, we were able to find the likelihood analytically. And this is very important when you estimate this model because it allows you to draw from the efficient posterior sampling distribution. Okay, so it makes the estimation much more efficient than otherwise. So it's a compromise between misspecification and efficiency. Yes.
You have the time varying, and as you said that the trend inflation is I1.
Yeah.
What is the probability that the trend inflation cross more than one time the threshold? It is very weak.
That I don't know. If you are under walk, that's a very general question. That maybe I should know. But if you are around the walk, what's the probability that it crosses a certain point more than once? I don't know. Out of my head, I don't know. I may give you an answer in 1 hour time. Okay. So that's is a compromise between efficiency and misspecification. So that's the idea. Suppose that this thing is truly nonlinear, right? Then what you can do, what mostly people do, you can just approximate that with a linear model, and that will make the econometrics very efficient. Computation is very easy and fast. Well, very easy and fast. Somewhat easier and faster, let's say. And but then if we do piecewise like this, that's a better approximation. And as I said, it's also very flexible because the slope can be whatever. And we basically are as efficient as the linear model with this thing because we were able to compute the likelihood analytically. So we think that actually that's a very good approximation. So this is just for the sake of time. Let's go actually quite fast on this. So these are what I just said. So these things allows us to do what the statistician calls the Rao-Blackwellization. So you sample. Thanks to the analytical results, you marginalize the optimal importance sampling distribution, and you are able, therefore, to have the most efficient one. Most efficient in econometrics is the one that minimizes the variance of the estimator, and that's why it's called Rao-Blackwellization. For the other parameters, we use particle filtering to jointly approximate the posterior and latent states. So we use particle learning for the parameters, and actually for tau, we have to use a mixture of normal distribution according to Liu and West. This is a strategy that was used in this paper, statistical paper by Chen et al. Proposed, and we have already used in a previous paper with Paolo. Okay. So let's go to the results, which I think are the interesting thing. So what we do, we estimate a linear model, and we estimate a piecewise linear model, okay? And compare the two. So if you look at the linear model here, that's the slope. There's only one slope because it's a linear model. And the slope of the Lagrange Phillips curve is estimated to be slightly negative point-wise, but not different from 0. So the Lagrange Phillips curve is vertical. If you estimate a linear model, you will find that the Lagrange Phillips curve is vertical. And this is just the average of the trend inflation in the sample. Okay. What about the piecewise linear model instead? In the piecewise linear model, you find that actually the model would, if you give the model the chance to have two slopes, it will take it. And you will find that tau estimate is around 4%. As I said before, it's 3.85. And below this threshold, the slope is 0. Is actually also point-wise almost 0 and not statistically distinguished from 0, different from 0. While the slope, if this when trend inflation is above the threshold, is -1. And that is the result I mentioned at the beginning. Every 1% point of inflation is going to cause a 1% point decrease in potential up. Okay, let me try to give you an intuition of what is happening here. Okay, we're very open about this, and the data actually speaks by themselves quite a lot. So on the top panel there, you have inflation. Okay, so that's inflation in the U.S. And here you have the estimate of the linear model. Okay, and this is since the way the estimation is done, you can think of it as a recursive estimation in standard OLS. Okay, so that's just a recursive estimates of the slope of the Lagrange-Phillips curve in a linear model. So the number that matters, like all the recursive estimation, is the last one. Okay, because that's what when you use the full sample. But the recursive estimate tells you how the estimate evolves when you add one data point at a time. And then you can see you start at 0, the band is large because that's the prior, and then you kind of around 0, more or less, so not statistically different from 0. But then the 70s hits, right? And inflation starts skyrocketing. So then and output goes down, as you know, that's stagflation. And then the model is going to capture this linear model by decrease the slope, and the slope now becomes negative. And it stays negative until the 80s, and is statistically different from 0 there. And then the great moderation hits, and then slowly this thing goes back to basically 0. It's actually slightly negative as from the estimate, 0.26, but not statistically different from 0. Okay. What happens if you allow the model to have two different slopes? Okay, so this is just the posterior and the prior. So if you have two different slopes, again, on the top panel you have inflation, and this is the tau, estimation of tau, which is around 4%. What happens there? The model at the beginning starts as before. It just uses one slope, and as you can see, the other slope is not used at all by the model. Right? But then the 70 hits, and the model, instead of using this slope, like in this case, and jump to negative values, it shifts to the other slope. It preferred to use a different slope, right, if you allow the data. And this slope becomes negative quite fastly, right? And then, the great moderation hits, and then basically this thing does not change anymore, any longer, and you revert back to the other one, which is also quite flat. And as you can see, also is much more precisely estimated than the one in a linear model.
Guido, shouldn't one of those always be flat to the extent that you're either obtaining information about on either side, on just one side of the threshold?
Yeah. So it's not exactly like this, but when this moves a lot, this doesn't move much, and vice versa, right? But here they're both flat, and then maybe you.
But you're still updating the low inflation slope in the high inflation regime.
It's jointly estimated, so you're updating a little bit both. But you update a lot here because lots of the movement is here, right? And very little here. You can see here it's basically flat. Then, if you are instead wondering why these things are flat from, let's say, 90 onwards, it's because the data are not informative about trends here. So another thing you need to obviously understand is that this is a time series model, so you need data that moves around, right? If data do not move around, then you don't get a lot of information from this data. And that's also, let me openly, give you the caveat. Then you can say, oh, okay, Guido, but everything is driven by the 70s, 80s. Yeah, these are the data we have. We don't, unfortunately, we don't have a macro lab and we can generate data. These are the data, and actually the identification comes from there because that's exactly the period in which you have some movement that allows you to identify stuff. And then. Yes, so going back to Facundo's question, so the next paper we will write is not only about the theoretical model, but also do something cross countries, and in particular a country like Argentina, in which we have most of these, the most of the movements and shifts would allow you to identify these things much better. We stopped the estimation with the financial crisis, yes. Yeah, I don't know. There's an issue of, The financial crisis, yeah, we left it out, and we can put it. The last periods, I don't know. There's an issue how to treat in the empirical analysis the COVID period, right? So there's Lenza et al. Paper, Giannone, etc. We can do that. Yeah, we can do that. At least as a robustness, yes.
Guido, just to follow up on the thing about the 70s, you mentioned the Benatti paper in the literature review, and that was kind of my prior before this presentation. And the way I remember it is saying, well, precisely because of this, the fact that you need unit roots, that basically you need the 70s. You cannot, I mean, E cannot conclude either way. So I mean, you have a different model, etc. But I was wondering how you find a way to
we have a different model and different results, and especially his model is non-linear. Sorry, it's not non-linear.
It's easier to extract information, even though you have more parameters?
If you estimate a linear model, then in our setup, with our, let's say, machinery, you will get that the Phillips curve is vertical. So it's actually when you allow the data to identify two different slopes that the data would identify them.
You focus on Japan, like for over the last 20 years, to have secular stagnation, you're likely to have a very flat portion of the Phillips curve at low rates of inflation, which are completely missing with US samples. So there's likely to be two kinks, like a high inflation kink and a low inflation kink.
But that's as I said. I mean, to go across country is the next step in the agenda. And Japan is surely a country that we will consider. I mean, this is just a first paper on US is already quite long as it is.
I was wondering if you try your specifications so that inflation affects the growth rate instead of the level of output, what you would get. Because for other countries, especially higher inflation countries, people have found that inflation affects negatively the growth rate of output, not just the level of output.
Yeah,
and
that
would be a much bigger effect.
We can actually try both.
More significant.
That would not be a problem, I think. I would just put the delta in the other equation. Yeah, that's a good suggestion, especially when we deal maybe with South American data. Yeah, thanks. Any other further question? Yeah.
So I was wondering, is there, in addition to the changes in inflation, there are also changes on the TFP and the technology side going on over time. So, and since growth is not endogenous, it's hard to capture.
This is going to be captured by the empirical model. The model is flexible enough to capture.
But still, like in the New Keynesian setup, then even like over the if you have a New Keynesian model with endogenous growth, you see the feedbacks from what's happening on the TFP side, even on the short-run Phillips curve, right? So I don't think the model can capture that in that curve.
You mean the theoretical model?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But But I haven't presented the theoretical model yet. But the model is extremely simple, so you're right. But that does not affect the empirical results. I think. 8 minutes. Yeah. If I understand the question, no, it's not about the empirical findings. So this is the posterior of the two kappas, and you can see that they are statistically significant and different, and statistically different from the prior. So this is what you get when you plot the long-run Phillips curve in the data. Okay, so this is the empirical model, and you can see here that the slope is slightly positive. Actually, so it's basically vertical. But then it starts to kick in this nonlinearity when you are above the threshold, and the cost can be quite high in terms of potential output. And indeed, so this is the estimate trend inflation. This is just to tell you that it doesn't look strange. It looks very similar to other trend inflation estimates that you have in the literature, like the one in the paper by Cogli and Spordone, for example. So the main point I think of the takeaway from this paper is this picture. So if this is true, then there is another output gap that we should care about. And we call it the long-run output gap, which is the difference between Y bar and Y star. So Y star would be the potential output under zero inflation, or if you want, under flexible prices, and Y bar T is the empirical potential output when inflation is above threshold, okay? And if you calculate this in the 70s, what you find here is that this, the loss in terms of potential output are humongous. So remember, is 1 percentage point of loss for every percentage point of inflation above 4%. Trend inflation was roughly 6% in this period. That means 2% loss in terms of output every period. Okay, so that for 10 years, and that's what you see here. That's an average loss of about 2% for about 10, 15 years. Actually, more than 10 years. So say 15 years. Yes.
Potential output that you're doing?
Yeah, so this is basically computing this, the difference between Y bar and Y star. So Y star would be the the potential output under zero trend inflation, and this is the one you get when you fit this lambda, the estimates of this delta function. So it's nothing more than that.
So in policy term, what should I do with this? Yeah.
You should keep inflation below 4% in policy term. That's what you should do. Right, and definitely so. So if you see inflation going up, this is about trend inflation. It's not about short-run inflation again. But if this thing becomes entrenched, then this thing starts to bite.
Wisdom is that when you go above 4 or 5, what matters is the variability of inflation.
No, there's a link between high inflation and volatility of inflation in the data. We captured that with stochastic volatility. And we also, so one thing that I was expecting, but it came out and say, the 70s is all about oil shock, etc. Stochastic volatility should take care of this, right?
But so the stochastic volatility doesn't affect trend inflation.
It does in the empirical model. So we have stochastic volatility in the trend inflation around the walk series.
No, but the delta function is a function only of the trend, not of the volatility. So the volatility is when volatility is high, trend growth is not, or trend output is not below trend.
No, but if there's big shock like the oil shock is actually driving these results, then my answer is that the stochastic volatility should take care of this big shock like happening in the 70s and affecting trend inflation. Right? So
I understood Giancarlo's question as the cost of inflation or the effect of inflation on output comes partly through inflation volatility.
I mean, in the empirical model.
Empirical is there.
Because
about when you are trend inflation.
Yeah. So I don't have it here.
And not also.
Well, I don't have it here, but Okay. So let's very quickly. I think I have 3 minutes or so. The empirical model, so the theoretical model. So the theoretical model is just a standard DRG model, new Keynesian model, 3 equation with some stuff to capture persistence like heavy formation. We estimate this thing under the anticipated utility assumption, which is standard, otherwise we cannot do anything like this, but is coherent with the random walk assumption. We have a stochastic volatility for force shock, discount factor, technology, monetary policy, and trend inflation. But more than anything, we have a model that looks like this, in which parameters are changing with trend inflation, right? So we log linearize around the trend inflation, and trend inflation is changing every period. So you have a model in which the steady state, let me finish, in which the steady state, sorry, Cesar.
My question earlier is the policy. I guess I want to know the Taylor rule, what's specification with Taylor rule?
Yeah, it's a Taylor rule.
But what's the output gap you take?
We take the empirical one, not deviation from natural rate, if that is the question. Okay, so that's the model. So we are going to estimate a model that is nonlinear in 2 ways. So there is stochastic volatility and time varying steady state. So again, we have to use a nonlinear method, use the same particle filtering strategy that we used before. This is the estimation of the parameter. They make sense. And that's the estimation of trend inflation. It makes sense. And the final picture I think I want to arrive is this one. So the estimates in the theoretical model model is the black line, and that's the estimate of the long-run Phillips curve. And you can see the estimate of the long-run Phillips curve is inside the estimate of the blue bands, which is the empirical estimation of the long-run Phillips curve in the empirical model. So this model is a model that replicates the empirical evidence. As I said, there might be other models, and we might want to try other models, and we may want to try the assumption about growth rate or other countries. But for the US, it seems that this model is doing a good job in replicating the empirical evidence. And this also replicates, obviously, the long-run output gap. They look different, these two pictures, because one is smooth and the other is not smooth. We have difficult times in computing these smoother shocks in the DSG, in the empirical model. Okay. So conclude, what is the long-run relationship between inflation and output? That's what this paper is about. The time series model suggests that the long-run Phillips curve is non-linear, negatively sloped. And it suggests also that a very simple generalized inflation model is able to replicate the evidence. Thanks for, I think so sorry, Cesar, we had a standard Taylor rule, but we had I think it is in deviation from the natural rate in terms of flexible price equilibrium.
The fact that you are using this long-run gap Phillips curve, I find it interesting, but I was more seeing that now that you bring into the model, how I'm taking into account that long-run output gap into the
Phillips curve? Into the Taylor rule. The Taylor rule is just a standard Taylor rule, so you get inflation, deviation of inflation for the target, which is time varying, and is exogenously time varying. So that's another limitation of the model, right, in terms of policy in particular, because also in the model, trend inflation is completely exogenous, it's just on the walk, while you might think that has something to do, at least, with the inflation target of the bank, which is endogenous.
Thank you so much for having me here today. So let me get back to the basics, essentially. So if you have, here we're looking at the long-run Phillips curve, and we're looking at the relationship between inflation and output. And the conjecture is that if you have a vertical long-run Phillips curve, then inflation is unrelated to the natural rate of output. And therefore, all the central bank needs to do is aim at keeping inflation at a low and stable level, and there would be no trade-off between inflation and output. If I am to take a positively sloped long-run Phillips curve, on the other hand, then the trade-off is there. You have to forego, in order to get an increase in output, you have to forego also an increase in inflation. So what this paper does, and I'll be very brief given that Guido's presentation was extremely clear on that. So what this paper does is it builds two models. You have a reduced form model and a structural model with the intention to investigate the nature of the long-run Phillips curve and the relationship between inflation and economic activity. And so they do that, first of all, using a reduced form model. It's a Bayesian VAR with stochastic trends, and the nonlinearity is introduced through this piecewise setup. While the generalized New Keynesian model here introduces time-varying trend inflation. Now, nonlinearity is not new. It's something that was already in the original Phillips paper. And so the idea here is to essentially understand what is the trade-off between inflation and output in the long run. And so what they find is that there is evidence in favor of a level of trend inflation, which is a little bit below 4%, whereby if you're below this level, then potential output is independent of trend inflation, and vice versa, if you're above it, essentially you have this negative correlation between the two, and therefore this would imply losses in economic activity as trend inflation is high. And the magnitudes of these losses are quite substantial. Okay, and ultimately what they find is that there is no statistical difference between the long-run Phillips curve they find between these two models. So here I'm going to do something extremely simple. I'm just going to take the two main series, right? I'm going to take per capita output growth, and I'm going to take the GDP deflator of the US, and I'm going to apply a very simple Cristiano-Fitzgerald filter where I can separate different frequencies, okay? And let us focus on the frequency, the long-run frequency here. And indeed, the data is suggesting a negative correlation. So the regularity that is prevalent in the data is well represented by the models of Guido and his co-authors. Now, an interesting feature is that correlations do vary. So depending on whether I'm on the full sample or I'm working on subsamples, correlations will change in magnitude, obviously. Now, there were some brief conversations throughout Guido's presentation about what happens with the zero lower bound and what, in fact, can happen in a setup where an economy is actually looking for inflation rather than fearing inflation. And so I do understand the technical complications that are involved in introducing and accounting for the zero lower bound, but at the very least I would want to see a little bit more about what are the possible implications that you expect within your setup. And also how it would affect the threshold itself. Now, I would like to now move to these shorter frequencies, okay? And maybe this one, this medium frequency, might be a bit more relevant. And so what we notice here is that, in fact, correlations change in sign completely. So, as you can notice, in the earlier sample, correlations are negative and consistent with some of the results that Guido showed. But in the recent period and following the crisis, the correlation is in fact positive. And of course, this is very standard in this literature. It is expected that the estimation of the Phillips curve is sensitive to data vintages. This is a very well-known fact. Now, what I want to do is try and take a financial perspective to this paper. And I will refer to the paper by Guido and Ngo, a 2020 paper, where in this setup, they're looking at the correlation between the stock return, or the S&P 500 index in that setup, and the 10-year break-even inflation rate. So essentially here you have, in a way, your financial counterparts to output and inflation. And these can be seen as long run, given that given that equity seems to be forward-looking, and the break-even inflation rate is an expectation 10 years ahead. And as you notice, and this is simply in the latest part of the sample that is not in your estimation, the correlation is in fact positive. So historically, inflation is seen as something that investors fear, and it is negatively correlated with stock returns. But this association became positive in the US between 2008 and 2015, which is in the sample of Guido and Ngo, but it extended well beyond 2015. And so what they do is they take an off-the-shelf New Keynesian model that can reproduce this change in association that is due to the lower bound. And so what they find is that, in fact, demand shocks become important when the zero lower bound binds because the central bank is constrained. And so this is in sheer contrast to what you have in normal times, where it's supply shocks that dominate and that generate this negative correlation between inflation and rates. And therefore, inflation risk premia are positive in normal times, but throughout the last part of your the last part of the sample of the last recent years that are excluded from your sample, these premia were negative. So. As a whole, I would say that I would appreciate more understanding what drives the long-run nonlinearities, So what is the propagation mechanism within your models? And then how should the central bank adjust its actions based on this information? So here you have several things that pop to mind. So one is the mandate. So in terms of, should it be a dual mandate, price stability and economic activity / employment, however you want to frame it? Should it affect the preferences of policymakers in terms of whether they're harsh on inflation or they're happy to be a bit more lean on inflation, having economic activity in mind? The target level. And ultimately, I think that the fact that inflation expectations were heavily anchored, very well anchored, in the part of your in a period that is missing in your sample can be driving these differences. And here I have in mind a paper by Banque and co-author where they actually do a comparison between the US and Japan. And whereby in the US, inflation expectations were anchored from 2012 onwards, while in Japan it wasn't the case. So to conclude, I just want to say that I really enjoyed reading this paper. I think that there are a lot of contributions that are econometric in nature that I'm not an expert on, but I could fully appreciate the value in it. So in solving these models, estimating these models, so this is an important paper. It provides with useful frameworks to think about important questions, and it moves the conversation in the right direction. I think that it can be very important for monetary policy in the context of high inflation right now, especially with the recession fears that are coming up. So you can sort of, you have a framework that can allow you to quantify the cost of unanchored inflation expectations and the impact of higher trend inflation on economic activity in the long run. So overall, it was really a pleasure reading it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the interesting paper and discussion. I would like to, well, first let me say that I really like the empirical part, and I do believe that inflation has these negative effects on output and perhaps even on growth in the long run. I'm, however, curious to what extent we're happy with the explanation given in terms of the model, because do we like this model of inflation and the cost of inflation, again, in terms of the relative price dispersion created by aggregate shocks alone? We know that the data in the micro evidence speaks for the presence of idiosyncratic shocks and not aggregate shocks alone that create this price dispersion. And then the question is, the Calvo model really overstates the amount of price dispersion due to inflation. And so when you go to these more micro-founded models, you don't see this big amount of price dispersion as a function of inflation. And also, as inflation goes up, in the Calvo model, most firms start making losses, and they would be, they would be bankrupt and get out of the market. And so this model doesn't make much sense for inflation rates, say above 10%, in these models that I'm working with idiosyncratic shocks. So are we happy with the cost of inflation being explained by the way we have in the standard New Keynesian model? That's my broader question. Thank you.
Another question, Gilles?
It's good for you.
It's my pleasure.
Keep you on shape.
Running well. Okay, I think maybe talking about LRPC is a misnomer, because when we think of, well, if we go back to Bob Gordon's estimates answering Phelps and Friedman, he found a long-run Phillips curve in the conventional sense, right? He rejected the accelerationist hypothesis, and so there was a long-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment that was downward sloping. Now, what you find is that inflation is bad in the long run, right? And then there is a class of models, as you talked at the beginning, that predict these kind of things. And these are models where there is no nominal illusion or no nominal rigidity in the long run. It's just that the inflation tax matters because real money balances have real effects in the long run. For example, if we have money in the production function, or you mentioned, non-separability in utility function, etc. And there is nothing non-neoclassical about this whole class of models, right? And there is no nominal rigidity whatsoever. And then there is another class of models, a la Akerlof and Dickens, that say, look, there are nominal rigidities that persist in the long run. For example, wages, nominal wages cannot fall, and therefore inflation allows to reduce real wages where it's needed in the economy. This greases the wheels of the economy. And then you have a favorable trade-off, a positive trade-off between output and inflation in the long run. And then the Friedman critique or the Lucas critique would apply to this class of models in the sense that if we had a permanently lower inflation forever, maybe people will learn to reduce nominal wages after a while, and then in the very long run, this trade-off would disappear, right? But there is no way the trade-offs due to the inflation tax would disappear in the long run. It's a purely neoclassical argument. Then my other question is still, it seems that you are ascribing the supply shocks. I mean, the identification comes, as you said, comes from the supply shocks of the 1970s. And when you have a supply shock, output falls and inflation goes up. So it looks like you are ascribing these shocks to the long-run relationship between pi and y, but isn't it due to the specification? I could write another specification where this would be interpreted as short-term, maybe persistent supply shocks, and not as a long-term trade-off between output and inflation.
I would have a question on the interconnection between fluctuations on the technology side and the concept of potential output, because as I understood, it's a model with strictly exogenous technology growth. But typically in the New Keynesian models with growth and with endogenous trend growth, you then also get an endogenous component of TFP, which also fluctuates cyclically over time. And through that, you also get a technology gap. For example, after deep recessions, you would not revert to your initial trend path and so on. So there's also a long-run output gap in that, which is kind of missing in this setting. And I'm wondering how this, for instance, changes or biases the understanding of potential output and the output gap in this context.
Why don't you reply to the first set and then?
Okay, so first of all, thanks to you all for the important and interesting questions. So that actually convinced me even more that it's been a very good idea to come here to Paris and presenting the paper, a wonderful conference and wonderful people. So thanks, Sarah. Lots of food for thought. So bandpass filter, actually we are thinking of doing something similar to just to simply motivate the more involved, and you find that, all right? So that actually suggests that we're not doing something completely wrong. The ZLB, how to deal with that, that's exactly the reason. Since we at the moment we don't have a good way to deal with that, we stopped the samples. Going back to what Klaus asked before. How this affects the estimate of tau, I have no clue. I must confess that tau is not very well identified in data, but that's kind of obvious, right? So if you look at this, right? So it's piecewise, so you can play with the slope and the threshold a little bit, right? So if you think that the real model is the black one, you can see that there are a lot of different piecewise linear depending on threshold that can fit that approximately well, and therefore, I mean, it's not surprising that tau is not very well identified. The financial perspective is very intriguing, and we will look at the paper. Didn't know the paper. Let me tell you that this seems to me mainly about short run and not long run, and these are two very different animals, and that's also partly explain why there are tons of papers on the short run, and actually very little on the long run, because the long run is kind of a more difficult thing to identify, and you get a lot of questions, as you can see, about this. In the last part of the sample, actually from let's say 99 onwards, you get very little information about these trends. I mean, trend inflation is constant, right? So whatever. So you put that thing or don't put it, you don't get any information about the trends. And this is just the data. Then you have about what kind of mechanism caused the cost. I go back to that when answering to Anton. What the central bank should do. I said you should keep inflation below 4%. At least you should not have inflation above 4% for long periods of time, at the very least. The thing about the anchoring of long-run inflation expectations is also a very good suggestion. We should surely look into it. So let me go back to Anton's question, which I think is very important. So as Anton knows, I'm very sympathetic to state-dependent models. And Anton and co-authors have been working on that, and they did splendid work. And he's right. The Calvo model is just a reduced form model with a lot of strange things happening. This Calvo fairy visiting the firms producing with negative profits, fat tails, and it produce very high costs, even comparing to other time-dependent model like Rothenberg or Taylor. So, and I know one can also argue that the Calvo model price stickiness should depend on the trend inflation level. Now, the trend inflation here is never both before 6%, I believe. The estimated is roughly, so it doesn't go to above 10. There is this paper by Fernando Alvarez and co-authors about Argentinian data. Facundo's left, but in which they show that up to 2%, two-digit inflation, the Calvo probability of price stickiness is constant, with the very detailed granular data on prices in Argentina over a long period of sample. So that actually kind of say to us that as a first order approximation is actually not a bad approximation. Then if you take it literally, if the cost is the cost of price dispersion, then I don't believe it too. Then the question is, what is this thing capturing? And my take in that the value is 2 cents, probably even less, is the following one. So this model is a reduced form. It's a model that allows you to estimate difficult things like medium scale model or this thing. So it's very useful to have it. It kind of square has been checked. Square with the aggregate data. It's been checked on the granular data. Also the paper by Midrigan and Keogh. So we use it because it works. Okay. Then in terms of what are the source of the cost? Do we really believe that there are so big costs of price dispersion? Nakamura Stenson says no. My taken is that this is capturing some costs that are out there of high inflation due to relative price movements. Okay, so we know that when inflation is high, that's the very old Hayek. I'm old enough. The very Hayek argument, and then the markets are perfect and works well when the price is, because the price is the only thing that you need to know for your decisions, right? But inflation is basically putting a lot of noise on movements because maybe there is a little bit of price stickiness on relative prices. And then the price signals that is sent to the markets in terms of investment consumption decision now becomes blurred, right? And therefore the market is not functioning well. So that would be my take. And in some ways, this paper is telling... That's price dispersion, but in a, I say I don't believe that the way Calvo modeled it, but that way of modeling it, he seems to capture that, right? We don't believe that there exists a Calvo ferry. We don't believe that firms with negative profits are still producing, but this paper is suggesting that this model not only is a good approximation for the short-run dynamics of inflation, that's why we use it in all our medium-scale model, but is actually capturing also the long-run cost. Now, if you want to microfound that's another thing.
Guido, we need to wrap up.
Yes.
Otherwise, people will go hungry from this conference.
Yeah. In terms of TFP, thanks, Michael. I will actually, we should talk maybe over lunch. I would like to look at the paper, also going back to Anton's point, estimated model in which there is a feedback on inflation on growth. About Gilles' point, it's true. The inflation tax is, can be the inflation tax. So I can estimate a model just like a cash and advance model. And about the shocks, again, I think stochastic volatility take care of, empirically, of your concerns. Thank you very much for the lively discussion.